Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 39, and we're recording this on October 7th, 2023.
On this episode, I interviewed Dr. Carla Freeman, a senior expert on China at the United States Institute of Peace. We discussed a wide range of issues, including what has been accomplished through the flurry of high-level diplomatic talks between the U.S. and China, and whether there will be a Biden-Xi meeting at APEC in California next month. We also talked about the role of institutions, including the UN, in China's strategy in the Global South and its challenge to the current international order. We begin with breaking news about the recent attack on Israel. Moving on to our main stories, we explore waning support for Ukraine in the U.S. and how it will affect the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. Next, we discuss Indian nationalism in the wake of the diplomatic dispute between Canada and India. We then conclude with the interview with Carla Freeman. But first, what are we playing now? So even though we've been very busy lately, can't work all the time. So we both have been kind of enjoying playing, relaxing with some video games.
That's right. I mean, mine's pretty old school classic at this point, playing Disco Elysium, which I think came out in 2019 and was pretty...
It's not old school.
That's pretty old at this point. I mean, it's something that's been out forever. It's not like the latest and greatest what you're currently playing, Baldur's Gate 3. But no, I've been enjoying it. I mean, I had listened to a number of podcasts about it. And then I bought the game for you because I think what makes it interesting is it's just a point and click game, but the dialogue in it and the political theory and the depth of it is unlike, I think, any other video game, especially for a first time video game producer, pretty small team that's based out of Estonia. So it has this very post-Cold War sort of feel in a ex-Soviet state. And just really interesting. I mean, it's won all sorts of awards, but it's been a real fun playthrough.
Yeah, I enjoyed it when I played it too. It's very different though. It's kind of nihilistic, I would say, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing is you could play it from a variety of different... I mean, and a lot of it does come down to, I mean, both the personal choices around the character and then kind of the political philosophy that you choose to embrace kind of in your playthrough as well. But all of it, no matter what path you choose, you're generally punished by it, by the narrator as being, foolish, naive, or a psychopath, all of those. So you lose either way. So I guess at that point, it's nihilistic.
I guess, it's kind of dark.
It is dark, very dark, yeah.
I guess maybe that's more what I want. It's fun. It's a great story. How many pages of text? I think you told me once.
Yeah, I don't remember the pages, but yeah, it's millions of words.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So which makes it just a stunning accomplishment that you're writing the equivalent, I don't know how many novels, just to cover all the dialogue trees. And they even have like a little subplot within it about a small developing company that fails. And I think it's just kind of poking fun of having that much ambition with that little budget. And in their case, they pulled it off.
Yeah. So it's a fun game. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm playing Baldur's Gate, which is one of the latest, most, I guess, popular games that people are talking about. It's an RPG based on Dungeons and Dragons, sort of.
Yeah.
And I come to it as someone who knows nothing about Dungeons and Dragons other than it exists. So all of it, the background, all of it's kind of really new to me. A lot of it happens in the background, but there's still a lot of dice rolls you make to see if you're going to succeed in your persuasion or deception. And yeah, it's fun. It's captivated my attention.
Yeah, it looks really cool. And now with this, I am strictly old school because I never even played in college like the RPGs at the time, because I definitely had, my roommate at the time played Baldur's Gate 1. I distinctly remember kind of watching that in the corner of my eye. But really, the only thing that I played was back in the 90s, like Eye of the Beholder, which was, again, Dungeon and Dragon based. But I think it's interesting just how many elements of the board game and just the fact that the tabletop game has become so mainstream and popularized. There's a ton of podcasts of people just playing Dungeons and Dragons. I had no feel for what the game actually was until, probably 2010s when you had all these podcasts coming out about it. And then it was like, oh yeah, it's like the storytelling more than anything, like the tabletop. But then to see the elements, like you mentioned, the dice roll incorporated into the computer game now.
Yeah, I imagine quite a few people come to it like me, knowing nothing about Dungeons and Dragons and not really playing an RPG like this before. I mean, you say old school, but I guess I never really played very many video games until recently. So it's all new to me. The combat is hard for me.
There you go.
Constantly having to refight battles just to win.
Yeah.
So transitioning to something much more serious, today we woke up to learn about this attack on Israel, where Hamas launched hundreds of rockets, has launched an incursion into many of the southern Israeli towns, taken hostages. Last number I saw was over 300 people killed, although I've seen a lot of different numbers, so I'm not sure where they're getting them. But it's this terrible event that's still going on, and we definitely are thinking and praying for the people in Israel right now.
Yeah, it's stunning in the scope of the operation. So it seems to be, just based on what people are reporting online, it seems to be the biggest incursion since at least the Yom Kippur War about 50 years ago. Some are even going all the way back to the foundation of Israel in 1948 in terms of the scale of it, because nobody expected this sort of sophistication from Hamas. I mean, this was air, sea, land assault. Very coordinated, like you said, seems to have impacted 30 border towns and villages along the Gaza border. And I think most disturbingly is, the kidnappings, massive kidnappings of Israeli citizens, which is seen as conjecture on using those as leverage and also discouraging a future ground assault from Israeli forces in retaliation. But a massive security failure from Israel's standpoint. They were clearly caught massively off guard.
Yeah, I was listening on CNN, and the intelligence failure of this was pretty surprising, considered how monitored this area is. And so to not see this coming is pretty surprising failure on their part. Yeah.
And then the broader implication, obviously, there's been a celebration within Iran and from the Tehran government. Of course, famously a huge supporter of Hamas in terms of both arms and intelligence and technology. They're definitely seen as the one that have enabled an assault of this scale. But it's not clear whether this is being led or directed by Iran. I don't think there's really no evidence of that. And then, of course, the greater context around normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, with some speculation on, was this an attempt to scuttle that and kind of force Israel to never accept a two-state solution?
Yeah, I think that's one of the few things that makes sense, because I always think when you have an attack like this, there's going to be massive retaliation. It doesn't matter how many people that you kidnap, you unite Israel. They were interviewing the main opposition leader, and it was like, I oppose Netanyahu and everything, but this is not the time. We're united now. We need to deal with this. So unite the whole country of Israel against you, where you have some people who were not happy with some of the far right elements of the Netanyahu government and what they were doing in the Gaza Strip, West Bank areas. So the only thing that makes sense is to trying to scuttle these talks that might have brought normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yeah, there's definitely that element. The other point of view that I saw online was of course, the Palestinian leader Abbas has been very weak the Palestinian Authority, very dysfunctional. So there's thought that Hamas and some of the leadership within is trying to position itself for a post-Abbas future. And this gives them kind of the legitimacy of pushing back against the Israeli state, creating the leverage with the kidnappings. So it could also be driven by internal politics within Palestine itself, beyond obviously the advantage that Iran gains from it by potentially scuttling any normalization with Saudi and the Gulf states.
Well, and they themselves might not be happy about this idea, like almost that they would be forgotten by Saudi Arabia in the effort to normalize relationships with Israel.
Yeah.
So I think that's a motivation that goes beyond just Iran, but a motivation for themselves as well.
Yeah.
So I just want to emphasize this is just happening. It's still ongoing. By the time we release this recording, a lot more will be known about it. But this is just kind of our initial reaction to this terrible event. Moving on to one of our main stories is the declining support in the U.S. for Ukraine funding and what that means for the future of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yep. So in this episode, we're taking a step back from the battlefield, which frankly hasn't made any significant movement in the month or so since our last episode. So with the counteroffensive seeming to fall well short of expectation, the U.S. and NATO allies are facing up to a much longer conflict in order to achieve what we've talked about before is what are the minimum gains necessary for peace, which is really trying to push Russia back to the 2022 borders. So ensuring that they're not rewarded for their aggressive action in any way. But even that seems a long way off. And I thought the Economist had an article that came out on September 21st and really framed it nicely, I think, in two ways on the why there's the challenges in a long-term war. And the first we've talked about before, but I thought they had some really interesting context. But one is just around the material needs of the war and production capacity. And I don't think people acknowledge this enough, but we have to acknowledge that Russia has responded remarkably well since its early failures. And they're in the middle of full mobilization of their society. And this includes production capacity. And I was a little stunned by this figure, but it kind of makes sense, both given maybe the Russian economy has shrunk some, has been impacted, but that they've pivoted so much of the economy towards the war effort. So that Russian military spending now makes up 40% of their national budget. Even though Russia is a small economy, I mean, tiny compared to NATO, they're dedicating a gigantic percent. I mean, this is orders of magnitude above. What does the U.S. spend? 5% of its total
defense.
Yeah.
We're also not directly involved in a war.
Right. But then on the production capacity side, so they cited Russia can produce now 500 to 800 tanks per year, which is a level that seems completely unimpacted by Western sanction. They're able to get in even the targeted components like semiconductors are smuggled in from Hong Kong or Central Asia. So it seems like in terms of impacting the production war effort, none of this is happening. And the
sanctions are not effective.
Right.
So we learn what the limits of sanctions can do. And in impacting the war effort, they just haven't been successful at all.
Yeah. And maybe it affects the domestic, the civilian population, but it's just because they're completely disempowered. I don't know if there was hope that, this would make it too costly and that you'd have internal divisions, protests that even the Russian state couldn't suppress. But they've done the rally around the flag fairly successfully, complete control of the media.
I think if anyone understood anything about Russia, and I, not being a Russian expert, could have told you a lot of those aspects of the authoritarianism in Russia, that was also extraordinarily unlikely that there would be that possibility for actors to take down Putin.
Right. I think that was recognized, but I think there was still that hope, especially early on. And then I think it was projecting the early incompetence of the Russian military onto like all aspects of the Russian state. And that just hasn't proven true. The other element, which we talked a lot about, is so much of this conflict, they talk about the big military platform, the tanks, the F-16s, like that, but it's all about their artillery production and the shell production.
And drones.
And drones, I think to a lesser extent, in terms of like retaking territory, it's just the sheer volume of artillery shells that are supplied. Because if they're using 15,000 a day, then the enormous amount that you need across a year is huge. But the other interesting part was just contrasting the cost for like the manufacturing of it, where the cheapest that NATO can manufacture, apparently in Estonia, is $6,000 per shell, but Russia could do it for $600 just because they got cheaper labor. It's not as high quality, but it gets the job done. And because they have state-owned companies, they don't have the same profit margin demands. So you have that competition. And then Russia's pivoted its industry in a much quicker fashion, that the production capacity, they are now easily supplying what they need for the battlefield, while NATO also attempting to pivot and has increased production, I think over doubled the production of artillery shells since the beginning of the war. But it's going to be until the second half of next year or 2025 before they can actually either meet or exceed Russian production. And some people see, well, you're not going to make territorial gains until you can outgun the Russian capacity. So from that material side, you see kind of that gap and that inability to dedicate the resources. I mean, we've been able to fill it by drawing down supplies, first from our own inventories, but now from South Korea. They're even buying from, on the down low, I think, from unaffiliated. So giving Ukraine funds so they can buy from Egypt, so they can buy from Pakistan, just getting any supply that they possibly can, while the West takes a very long time to ramp up production capacity.
Yeah, I think it's about, well, one of the big differences is when you're at war, then you're going to naturally devote your economy, right? If the U.S. was a direct participant in it, I guarantee you more of industry would have pivoted towards surge capacity in this manner. So I think that's a really big difference. I think there's been this hesitancy in the U.S. and Europe just to decide that they were going to be committed to a longer war. And because I teach all this stuff, people always think wars are going to be quick. And most of the time, they end up being these wars of attrition. And I think the U.S. and Europe never really accepted that would be the possibility, or that in order to maintain this war, that they would actually have to mobilize their industrial base, expanding capacity, not just surge capacity, right? So what the articles talk about working extra shifts. And so the industrial base is limited in what it can surge now because it's so consolidated and efficiency based and not like stockpiles and stuff. So there's a limited capacity to surge. And basically that's what both areas have been relying on to fully support this war in order to make the kind of gains that are hoped for or to meet Russia's capacity would have always involved expanding capacity. And there might be a realization to do that, but expanding capacity can take 2 years to really develop.
Which is basically what they're projecting,
to meet those capabilities. And that's always the problem in war. Like, it takes a long time to ramp up your mobilization. And in this case, it's taking even longer because no one wanted to face the fact that they would need to expand production. And I think the real goals from both sides are, if the goal is we will fight Russia at any cost, then that decision should have been made a lot sooner. But there seems to be reluctance to say that as long as Russia is fighting Ukraine, we will definitely be in this because it's in our strategic interest to weaken Russia or not allow Russia to win this contest.
Yeah, and I think and several people, there was a article in The Guardian, I think Emma Ashford in her Substack article raised the same point of the shift in the goals and kind of the lack of clarity of goals for both the U.S. and NATO on what kind of the end state looks like. And I think the general consensus is that at the beginning, there was a more realistic goal of what Ukraine could accomplish. But now it's shifted to that maximalist goal of what Ukraine supports, of the full expulsion of Russian forces from all territory, including Crimea, which seems far less palatable. And I think the other thing is this time last year, after Ukrainian forces took massive amounts of territory around Kherson and Kharkiv, there was optimism. There was just a projection into the future that, well, Russian military is incompetent. They'll always be incompetent.
Yep.
And that's what's led into this stat, which I was a little stunned by. I mean, mind you, the borders haven't changed a lot in a year, but Russia's actually gained more territory in the last year than Ukraine in its counteroffensive. So, yeah, I agree. It was basically just this projecting into the future with the current state of the battlefield without accounting for your enemy isn't incompetent and that they can change and adapt too, which Russia has done very well.
Yeah, I think for some reason that surprised people that you could adapt like that.
I think we were believing our own propaganda. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes that is the problem when we do believe our own propaganda too much. But I think we're talking about goals. One of the difficulty about goals is not just Ukraine wanting this maximalist territory back, but also it's not like Russia's given any sort of opening to negotiating away from their goal of taking over Ukraine.
Right, that's true.
And so I think that has to be kept in mind when there's critique of U.S. goals, which is valid, but it's not like there's a possibility of diplomacy right now. There's been no willingness on the Russian part to accept some sort of compromise at this point. Right. So it's not just Ukraine, it's Russia's goals as well.
Yep. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, there really hasn't been that opening.
And that's why it's hard to see this as anything but a long, grinding war. And I think we need to stay committed to it because I think it is in our strategic interest. But obviously, that's becoming a debate in the United States. And that kind of leads us to what brought up this topic for us is just looking at within the U.S. population, as well as in Congress, just this declining support to be engaged in this kind of long-term war and to continue to support Ukraine. I think, again, the thinking was, okay, we'd be able to accomplish a lot more in a year or two. And then this idea that it turns out to be this grinding war, sort of what Millie and some people did predict from the beginning and how wars usually end up going. Because like I said, we think they're going to be quick, but more often, a lot more often, they end up in some sort of grinding like this. And so you have the U.S. not wanting to continue, a lot of people, not the U.S., but a lot of people wondering how long we can keep supporting, again, this idea we don't want to expand our industrial base. We were content to just give them what we had for a while. And now there's concern that, well, if we're not expanding our industrial base, then we're drawing down on stockpiles. And obviously, we have to think about a conflict with Taiwan. And so people think that we're getting distracted by that or we're undermining our security or Taiwan's security. But I think it's still surprising, to me at least, about how strong the contingent in the Republican Party is waning against in support. And then this whole government shutdown bill, which got passed at the last minute, much to my own surprise, excluded funding for Ukraine, which is this is a big problem. And so you're seeing a real fight amongst Republicans and in the House. Can we even get more money approved?
It's an open question. And it's not because I think if a bill is allowed as a straight vote,
right,
that there's no doubt that it would pass because you still have over half of Republicans in support of Ukraine and virtually 100% of Democrats. So there's no doubt in a straight up vote that it could pass.
But that's not how the political process works.
Right. And especially, I think, with the Kevin McCarthy, of course, losing historically losing his position as House Speaker after being elected on a very weak position that allowed a single House member, in this case, our good buddy Matt Gaetz from Florida, was able to bring an end to McCarthy's speakership. And now you have an open battle between two leaders, although others may come to front. But right now it seems to be a competition between Jim Jordan from Ohio, who's an ultra MAGA supporter, very stringently against Ukraine, has voted against almost every measure of support for Ukraine. And then Steve Scalise, also I would argue kind of MAGA, but is one that has a history of supporting Ukraine. So it really could come down to just the way that Congress works and the power that the speaker has to stop legislation from reaching the House floor for a vote. If Jim Jordan becomes Speaker of the House, you very well could be in a situation where further support for Ukraine is not approved.
Yeah, so it's really frustrating that you can have still national will behind something. And then, of course, just the way the system is, if a significant minority opposes it, then they can have the power to prevent it. And so as a president, as executives in foreign policy, it's this constraint on you want to have policies that are like, we support Ukraine no matter what. That's our policy. That's our goal. But then we may lack the material ability because of having our hands tied behind our back.
Right. So, it's not clear at all. Ukraine has enough funding from the U.S. I think the Defense Department is authorized for another $5 billion of weapon transfers before the end of the year. But after that, there's no more funds approved. And then looking ahead, of course, to 2024 with the election and potential Trump administration coming in, it's far from certain. So I think this is when people are looking towards...
It's very unlikely to have future funding.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If Trump were to win.
Yeah. Let alone NATO's survival and complete capitulation to Russia. I mean, it's very unclear on all of that. Although, to be fair, when Trump was asked, he was like, nobody's been tougher on Russia than me. And it's not 100% clear whether they would be able to, given the split within the party, to be able to pull complete support from Ukraine. So I think in wrapping it up, then a lot more of the future onus and support in terms of de-risking this entire situation falls on Europe, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, this is a conflict in Europe's backyard. Their security is directly at stake. And I think the encouraging thing that you've seen here, despite the recent election in Slovakia and having a far-right, pro-Russia party come to power, is that for the most part, Europeans are still very supportive. And you've seen big pivots from both France and Germany in terms of offering up additional support to the point that I was surprised to see this, but it was a total spending on the Ukrainian war put out by the Kiel Institute, which is a German think tank, showing that on both military and financial aid, Europe has now surpassed the United States in terms of support for Ukraine. And that's only been the recent, last 6 months or so. So you have seen a major step up in effort and support for Ukraine. It was interesting even seeing on the production capacity side, Ukraine wanting to, obviously being heavily motivated, is trying to build up its own industrial capacity. And it had a meeting with defense contractors in Europe, trying to get them to co-invest for additional capacity for both artillery guns and for tanks being manufactured within Ukraine, and got several big military contractors and providers from Europe signing up for that.
Yeah, so I think it brings, again, as I talked with Dan Hamilton, the thing about the support and funding has been that it's in funding, that it's in money, that they've relied on the U.S. for most of the military equipment and weapons by far. And one of the issues is Europe would have to make up for this gap. It needs to dramatically expand its defense industrial base, which is kind of also in its interest. For its own economy, there's a lot to benefit from having a defense industrial base and being able to compete with the U.S. in selling weapon systems. but it just has never shown a willingness to do that. And in some sense, like you said, it makes sense, the burden being on Europe, because it is their security that is directly threatened. But again, the willingness to invest in a defense infrastructure is something that's always on the line in Europe. And maybe this will encourage it. But again, like we said, I think it would take even longer for Europe to expand its industrial base beyond 2 years, because it's so entrenched in not funding that. So I think that's the big problem. And I just wanted to finish with the article in The War on the Rocks that suggested that we shouldn't be putting our industrial capacity into building these munitions, because we can get supply from other places in the world because they're relatively simple and more standardized. Than we can't get high-tech equipment from elsewhere in the world. Only we can produce that. And so that was an interesting debate. It's definitely because it's one of the debates that we're having in my class for my students' papers. And I thought that was just an interesting point. Well, some of the problems is we try to do both, and we're not necessarily capable of doing both. A lot of my students did agree that the high-tech stuff is where you probably is the only way you can really gain advantage over Russia. But at the same time, I have other students and acknowledge, though, these wars are still mostly fought with these sort of simple munitions. So yeah. I think it was interesting that they brought that up, and I think it would be an interesting discussion that should be had about how we want to expand our industrial base and what can we actually get on the world market.
Yeah, I mean, that just got me thinking on that Economist quote, if Estonia, for instance, is the cheapest place to manufacture munitions, this idea of friendshoring within the competitive advantage space. So within your NATO allies, who has the competitive advantage for manufacturing munitions? If it's Estonia, if it's the Czech Republic, whoever, that's where you should have these like co-investments or concerted effort instead of the domestic focus of, we need to do this here. You kind of accept that we need to do this together, and whoever has that competitive advantage from an economic standpoint.
So from a purely logical standpoint, that stands. The problem with doing it is then you're investing in other countries and companies that are not your own.
Right.
And the lack of political will to do that.
Even though collectively, everybody's better off.
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, that's the same argument around trade too, but...
No, I mean, in this case, I think it's not even about distribution of gains. I mean, people would be collectively better off, but we want that money to be spent on our own companies and not
right,
others.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps that up. Definitely a debate that will be continuing in the U.S., and there's lots of interesting aspects of that. But we also wanted to talk about the India-Canada dispute over an assassination of a Sikh community leader that has led to some pretty high tensions between the two countries.
Yeah, so this one really caught, I think, everybody a little bit off guard, just because it's so rare for a leader, in this case, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, announced on September 17th that claimed they had intelligence that agents of the Indian government had basically carried out a targeted assassination of the Sikh community leader in British Columbia. So a direct violation of Canadian sovereignty. The individual assassinated was Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and he was well known for advocating for Sikh separatism and a separate nation, which has been a movement for a number of decades called Khalistan, that would include parts of India's Punjab and northern Rajasthan, which we traveled in earlier this year, and is all directly located close to the Pakistan border. There's a couple interesting things here. One, it highlighted the long-term independence movement from the Sikh minority within India. But what surprised me was how long-running, in particular, one, this movement is, and then two, kind of Canada's involvement in it. So it's not something that just came out of the blue, but goes all the way back to the 1980s. starting off with a little bit of background about the Sikhs and about this separatist movement. So the Sikhs are a relatively small religious minority within India of about 25 million, which is just 2% of the Indian population. There's a really great article from The New Yorker that interviewed Professor Gurupal Singh at London's SOAS School, and definitely encourage everybody to check that out on the links we'll provide in the show notes. But the Sikh diaspora really began, in terms of why you have kind of large Sikh populations in Western countries, began under the British Empire, because Sikhs were really overrepresented in military and police functions within the imperial forces that Britain would station in different countries. Now, when independence came in 1947, the Sikhs advocated strongly for a Punjabi-speaking state, that's their native language, in Punjab in northern India, but failed to get that at the time of independence. And this eventually led to a series of pretty horrific violent events in the 1980s, which I was only vaguely familiar with. But basically across the mid-80s, from a period from 1984 to 1985, you had a violent insurgency that the Sikhs led between the exchanges from Sikhs targeting Hindus and kind of the ruling coalition. You had nearly 30,000 deaths. It resulted in the assassination of the prime minister at the time, Indira Gandhi. You had a big massacre at the Sikhs' holy site, the Golden Temple. And then where Canada comes in, you had the bombing of a Air India flight from Toronto to London that killed nearly 330 people on board, which still to this day remains the largest terrorist attack that has impacted Canadian citizens. So really long history in terms of like where Najjar fits in. The Indian government had requested his extradition, but had never presented sufficient evidence under Canadian law to have him extradited. So that's the reason why he was targeted. And obviously, we talked about more on just the general rise of Hindu nationalism under Modi, and the fact that domestically, they've cracked down on any minorities and critics of the Hindu national movement, particularly Muslims within India, but also the Sikh population as well. But it's seeing it expand not only to cracking down domestically, but also to critics abroad who are citizens of these countries.
Yeah, I found that really interesting aspect, the crackdown on academics speaking, because one thing that I see online from Indian scholars who are more part of this Hindu nationalism is they will attack anyone. If you say anything negative about India at all, you're racist. And I see that lobbed around all the time. And you're racist. You don't want India to be a rising global power. And so in these articles that we read for today, you just saw that it's not just this conflict between the Sikhs and their independence movement, but that you had people representing the lower caste, the untouchable caste, and how they were being attacked for studying it and bringing that to light. Yeah. It was really anything. You don't have to critique the Indian government itself just in any way to say that there was ever anything wrong about what India has done or is doing is considered unpatriotic or against India, which sometimes happens in the U.S. too, to a lesser extent. Well, there's less violence around it, but I mean, that's what we hear on the right all the time. Don't talk about slavery because
there's still less violence, but maybe not for long. We'll see.
But the thing that's concerned me is the way I do see any public figure or any other academic saying any of these things. I mean, I see it all the time when people are writing anything critical, because there are things to critique about India and their actions. Yeah. And then I just see, like, again, I'm not even talking about trolls. I'm sure there's a lot of trolls, or I'm talking about other academics attacking them as being racist.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So that's a little different take than this Washington Post article, which really, I mean, it mentioned like a conference being organized to critique Hindu nationalism and then but targeted like in a systematic way from, there's still non-government business associate and things operating within India for very powerful people, but receiving literally, this is a small online conference, receiving like millions of emails opposing it, getting death threats, rape threats, just really rough stuff. But that all came from from India organizations itself. But you're saying fellow were these academics in India then criticizing their Western counterparts, or are these Western academics criticizing other Western academics?
Mostly these are Indian academics in the West.
In the West, though, still.
But have really close ties to
Modi
obviously,
and
it's not like
Hindu.
they've been in the West for a long time.
Yeah, okay. I got you.
But I've just been surprised. So totally, obviously, the majority of, it wouldn't matter if just some academics were attacking each other, because academics attack each other all the time.
Yeah.
But just this, but academics don't usually call each other racist very often, and certainly not for just bringing to light any critique of Hindu nationalism. Say anything about it. As academics, you become really hesitant. Despite what people think, we don't like to be very controversial.
Right.
So I refrain from posting on India. Not that I'm on Twitter a lot, but when I do, because I feel like I'm not an expert at India. And so it'd be hard for me to defend myself. But all I want to do is point out legitimate things. And I don't want to be attacked as racist or ignorant. Anyway, it does suppress what you say. It suppresses what you say and what you do.
Yeah, and I think that's an active strategy, particularly by those kind of Hindu nationalist elements that are in the US or in Canada or in Western countries, of using the sensitivity around race, around minority rights, to throw that as a defense, just a blank check. You can never criticize anything around this because you're racist. And I thought that was particularly, I saw it, and this whole issue kind of got raised for me because I was on a train going up to New York, and I was passing close to Edison, New Jersey. Edison, I think, as we found out as we were preparing for the wedding that we attended, has a large number of Indian clothing shops, but also obviously compounded with that because there's a huge population of India. So 500,000 Indian Americans are in that location. But it's been kind of a hotbed of controversy. One of it was, so they had back in August, a India kind of national day, national parade. And at the parade, they featured a bulldozer with a picture of Modi. And, to the outside, you'd think, well, we're from the South. You see parades with farm equipment and things. So you would see a bulldozer and be like, okay. And you see Modi, it was like, okay, that's a little weird. But it's very symbolic because Modi and his administration has actively used bulldozers to punish particularly Muslim opposition, to actually bulldoze their businesses and their houses. So it was seen as celebrating this. It was a very divisive sort of thing. And you had not Edison itself, but I think a suburb of Edison, the city council was going to pass a bill that was going to investigate people that had ties to paramilitary Hindu nationalists. And that was met with such fierce opposition. But the core of the defense was that, well, you're just racist because you're looking at this thing. And that shut that down completely. So it's really pretty nefarious and well orchestrated. Just in reading these articles, it's very well funded. Supported by very rich business associations, both located within Canada, within the US, and India, that are supporting these movements. And it's just something that has kind of gone under the radar, but seems like it's penetrating more and more, these elements. And of course, I think the US has struggled with how to respond to this. Canada, very important trading partner, very close historic ally.
And there's U.S. intelligence as well.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That was involved in making this connection between the government agents and the assassination.
Yeah. So, but the Biden administration hasn't come out overly critical either, because we talked about before, there's basically a blank check for India to do whatever anti-democratic things it wants because of its value in countering China.
And so I think this will be a conundrum that just increases in visibility, because India is growing, is a rising power, and it matters how it acts. But if you have, if we can't critique India because we need India, all these things I always think kind of make a mockery of all our claims to human rights and all of that, because we won't critique our allies or countries if we need them. We just critique our enemies, countries we're not allied with. And I think that's a huge problem, for me at least. I think for a lot of people, that sort of hypocrisy. And so from my standpoint, you would both critique India, but continue to work with India because there's no really other option. But you wouldn't hesitate to critique what you see as negative.
Yeah. And I think, it's probably the immaturity and the history of it, the fact that India was so closely aligned to the Soviet Union. Of course, they're neutral, but, and we talked about before, their military is very well aligned with Russia. That, when you're in this precarious state, you don't have that deep history. Because I think we're more than willing to criticize other democracies and people we have a long history with. But when it comes to somebody...
But we don't criticize human rights records a lot of like Egypt and other countries.
There's elements within, and because it depends on administration to administration. But with this, it's a universal, we're not going to say anything bad about the Modi administration.
Yeah.
We're not going to go as far as like Trump did in 2019, having a big rally for Modi in Houston and all the elements of ultra Hindu nationalism there as well. But it's still not going to be, we're not going to offer these open-faced criticisms given the importance of India and the precariousness, I guess, historically of the ties with the U.S.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. Of course, we pointed out the good things that Modi has done as well. But I think it's important just on the international stage to be a little bit more consistent and to make this violence inside of India and outside of India make our point how unacceptable it is. I think some statement was warranted because this is a pretty egregious violation of Canadian sovereignty. And again, nothing that we say is going to change the practicality of the relationships, but it's the fact that we won't even go out and say it.
Right.
So for this episode, I also interviewed Dr. Carla Freeman at the United States Institute of Peace, and we talked about China. She's an expert on China, and we talked about a lot of what's happening right now. She mentioned some positive institution building and new frameworks between the U.S. and China and mitigating some of the conflicts that have been arising with the two countries. But we talked a lot about China and the UN, its role there, and how it uses that to solidify its relationship with the global South and challenging the Western powers. And so one of the fascinating things always is about China challenging, uses the UN to challenge the attitudes, universal attitudes about human rights and such, and for its own vision. And so it's always interesting to see how China uses Western-led institutions. Of course, the UN, Global South, has had a much bigger say in the UN than other institutions. But then we also talked about my hypothesis of a research project that I'm working on, which is that Chinese global institutions are better positioned to have influence in the global South than the U.S. And they've invested in projects that the Western institutions won't because they're seen as too risky and they'll never be paid back for. And so this has had a big role in increasing China's influence, positive views of China. And so I think it was an interesting conversation. And we also talked about how China hasn't necessarily, its ties with Russia has certainly not turned out to be negative in the way some people thought they might be hurt by the Ukraine conflict. Anyway, I hope you enjoy listening to it. I definitely enjoyed doing it. I'm here with Carla Freeman, a senior expert for the China program at the United States Institute of Peace. She specializes in China's foreign policy, China and non-traditional security issues, and U.S.-China relations. Hi, Carla. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kellogg, Anita, for having me this morning.
So to get started, there have been recently a flurry of high-level diplomatic talks between the United States and China, including discussions by the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, most recently by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and their Chinese counterparts. What is the purpose of these talks?
Well, that's a great question. And all of us watching U.S.-China relations are trying to figure out exactly where this is all leading. As you pointed out, there have been a series of meetings really beginning in the middle of the summer with Blinken's visit to China and continuing through Yellen, then culminating in the visits and meetings you've described between Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan, and including Blinken at the United Nations with China's Vice President Han Zheng as well. All of this suggests that there is an effort to make a breakthrough of some kind in the U.S.-China relationship to at least put it on a more positive footing. And there are a number of reasons that we can go into for why that would be the case. But relations have been extremely strained, particularly since February and the balloon incident that derailed a planned Blinken visit to China.
Yeah, so how likely do you think these talks are to succeed in ratcheting down tensions between the U.S. and China?
Well, there's already signs that they have helped. I mean, we just saw the launch of a new, I think it's called the Economic and Financial Working Group that came out of Janet Yellen's visit to China this past summer. So that is a step forward. That involves people from the Treasury Department meeting with Chinese counterparts on financial and economic issues, macroeconomic issues. So that is an important development, one that is designed to deal with the challenges that both the United States and China face with their economies and to better coordinate that. And we can, if you're looking for a reason for why it's important for the two countries to do that, it's not just about the two countries' economies, but we're talking about the world's two biggest global economies. So it's very, very important to other countries in the world that they have a sense that the two countries are talking about their own struggling economies, because that will impact everybody in the world.
So there's also talk that one objective of these discussions is arranging a Biden-Xi meeting. How likely is such a meeting to occur, and what would each side get out of it?
Yeah, so it isn't clear that she will come to San Francisco for the APEC leaders meeting there, but there has been a lot of talk about that happening. I think that China has not yet decided whether she will join that meeting. He did not attend the UN General Assembly meeting in person or online this year, because online wasn't an option. He also didn't attend the G20 summit, which is interesting. So the odds actually are not great that he will attend that meeting. But clearly, it is a target of opportunity that the two sides are working toward. And I think if they can establish enough common ground or a set of outcomes for that meeting that where the Chinese side feels like China will appear in a good light and there'll be some kind of good outcome document that will set the U.S.-China relationship on better footing, then I think we'll see Xi make the trip to San Francisco.
Building off what you said about Chinese President Xi Jinping not attending the recent UN General Assembly, how important is the UN and China's global strategy to challenge the current US-led international order?
Yeah, I mean, the UN has been a really important forum for China. Of course, as you know, it didn't have the seat on the UN Security Council or indeed any representation. That is, Beijing did not have any representation in the UN until 1971. Then as the UN pivoted to welcome Beijing and oust Taipei, the capital of the Republic of China, and brought Beijing and the PRC into the United Nations, China seized that opportunity and very quickly started to play an active role. I mean, partly it owed the pivot in recognition or representation by Beijing rather than Taipei to the support of the developing world, where China cultivated relations for decades under Mao Zedong's leadership and then lobbied hard to developing country support. So the so-called global South was really key to putting the Beijing into the United Nations in 1971. And so China has used that history and the leadership role that many countries in the developing world assigned to it and that it chose to take the mantle up of, because as its economy developed very rapidly, it became the epitome of success for developing countries. It's used that influence that is given it to play a large role in the United Nations, particularly in the UN General Assembly, where it has started to play a bigger role in leadership, various committees, and to try to shape the decisions that the UN takes to reflect a vision for the world, if you will, that is more China friendly and that it would argue is also more developing country friendly. But this is a world also that doesn't share a liberal interpretation of human rights and other facets that so-called liberal world order highly value. So the United Nations has become a place in some ways that is also a venue for struggle between these competing visions for how to manage international relations. One of the things that's happened most recently is that China has advanced a couple of new global initiatives and is using the United Nations to build support for those. One of them is the Global Security Initiative that China launched in 2022. Even before that, it launched the Global Development Initiative, which really focuses on promoting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So it has used those initiatives and a third called the Global Civilization Initiative to advance, first of all, China's leadership as a provider of so-called international public goods in advancing sustainable development. It wants to position China as a leader in that area through this Global Development Initiative. And then the Global Security Initiative wants to use that to highlight China's role in solving security problems around the world in a very different vision for how the international security order should look compared to today. This is where the language associated with that is it advances a lot of Xi Jinping's thinking about international security. And it also uses language like, opposing hegemony, U.S., sometimes veiled, sometimes much more overt critiques of the U.S. approach is associated with alliances and so on. And then this Global Civilization Initiative, which we're just learning more about, appears to be an effort to hold up diversity of values. And if you see its implications for universal human rights are quite profound, at least the human rights in terms of an emphasis on the rights of the individual. Those are all three initiatives that China has been promoting through the United Nations. And it has even developed, in the case of the Global Development Initiative, a Friends of the GDI within the United Nations. UN is a very important platform, and that's just the UN General Assembly. There's also the UN Security Council, where, of course, China is a veto-wielding permanent member.
Yeah, again, that's really fascinating. Do you think China is having some success in its efforts to push back against the traditional notion of liberal human rights and other initiatives that the UN is commonly known for?
I think where it has a lot of traction is in this idea of non-interference and in its push against so-called universal values, including the universal views of and definitions of human rights. I think there is quite a bit of support in the post-colonial world for that. This notion that the most powerful countries in the world, the advanced economies, are promoting their own norms, rules, values that serve their interests, foremost reflect their historical traditions. I think that resonates around the developing world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the aspirations of people in these societies do not align with the aspirations of, say, that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think on the one hand, there is this strong feeling that countries and these fairly new nations that had these traumatic experiences, colonial experiences, want to be able to chart their own ways forward. And their governments like the notion of non-interference also as a way to safeguard stronger states, in many cases, authoritarian states. And so on the one hand, you have these strong governments supporting this vision of non-interference and often goes hand in hand with a more material view of human rights, an emphasis on development over, say, human liberty and those kinds of freedoms. And then you have a populace that often struggles for all of the positive values that are associated with the Universal Declaration, for example. So it creates this tension in many societies between governments on human rights issues and their people.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. One thing that I always find interesting about China's leadership of the Global South is that they are now this kind of powerful country, unlike the Global South, and have their own initiatives that could be seen as even neo-colonial. How do you think that plays out in the Global South?
That's a great question. I think we're going to see this become a more lively and foregrounded debate, partly because this is the 10th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And according to some observers, it's now crossed the $1 trillion mark in terms of amounts of investment and loans and so on. It's all a big mush as far as what actually the kinds of investments or monies or lending is, because there are multiple ways that China has carried out Belt and Road projects around the world. But the bottom line is there's a lot of countries that are facing repayment challenges on the Belt and Road and have been pressuring China to renegotiate their loans. Sri Lanka, which was the centerpiece for the debt trap diplomacy idea involving the Hambantota port, where after there were challenges repaying a loan, it was restructured so that China was given extended access to that port for, I think, a 99-year period or something like that. And that became the concept debt trap was coined to describe that experience. It much will depend on the ability and the way that China negotiate the loans that countries are unable to pay around the world. If it starts to take collateral in access, like the Hambantota port, we may see countries start to balk and label China a neo-colonial actor. It's not a word that hasn't been used before, but it's not the main view that developing countries have about China, which remains generally quite positive.
Right. And kind of going on to the other institutions. So a project that I've been working on, well, at the very earliest stages, is that this idea that Chinese regional and global institutions are better suited to engaging with the Global South than Western institutions have been, and thus are an important vehicle for China to spread its global influence. I mean, what do you think of this thesis?
I think you're onto something. And some of the work that I've been doing, I think, affirms your preliminary findings. And I think it's one reason that you've seen China proliferating its own sets of institutions, or what I've called with other colleagues, Sinocentric multilaterals or minilaterals, because those organizations, like, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which China and Russia with the Central Asian countries started in the 90s, not under that name, but it rests on a principle of non-interference and other values that remain important to post-colonial and fairly new states, like, say, the Central Asian countries. And so it's very different from agreeing to a body. For example, some of the trends within the United Nations say on the responsibility to protect that allow an international body to intervene in some cases without the permission of the nation's capital where there's a problem on humanitarian or human rights grounds. That's deeply troubling. So a lot of these organizations, new organizations, SCO, not so new, but fairly new, or the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation and others, these have more narrow functional objectives in some cases initially, and then those may expand, but they rest on principles of a rather informal structure, and one where big powers certainly play the leading role. But fundamentally, the idea is that if we all just take care of our own houses, then we don't need to interfere in each other's lives. I think we're going to see, some of these structures are still fairly new, and they may start evolving more directive charters, more rules and more as they go on, more norms that have to be upheld by all member countries. But to some extent right now, they are really, describe ASEAN as a sort of talk shop where there can be some collective decisions, but, and also a chance for big powers like China to advance their own positions and often writing checks. They're often the paymaster in the mix. And, China looks at the history of U.S. global leadership and says, a lot of U.S. power rests on the power of the ability to write checks for global public goods and provide the operational capabilities to do that. So in some senses, it's following the leader here, but with very different values and objectives.
Yeah, speaking about writing checks, Chinese lending is way down. I was looking at a chart of their lending to Africa, and the dip from 2016 to 2022 cannot be emphasized enough. So how much is this positive feelings towards China and the global South a result of the money that they've spent there, and what will happen now that they're not spending as much money?
Definitely money talks. And the fact that China was willing to come in to countries that risk assessments and the way that projects are financed, by other countries and even by the Bretton Woods multilaterals, China was willing to come in and build that dam and construct that power plant and road. All of that brought about very goodwill around the global South. And you're absolutely right. The lending has fallen and other financial vehicles have not been being used as much, and project scale is way down. So, and a lot of projects remain unfinished, and countries that borrowed to finance them are having difficulty, as I mentioned before, paying back those loans. So this will be a challenge for China. And I do think it's one reason that China has also launched these different global initiatives, partly because this is a campaign now to also boost global public opinion about China. But unless China can deliver materially, it's going to face an uphill battle to retain goodwill in the global South that it has enjoyed, especially since the BRI was launched a decade ago.
Yeah, definitely. I was also thinking, as you were talking too, about BRICS and how China was recently behind an expansion of BRICS to make that institution more powerful. On the same hand, you have India as being this really big country in the BRICS as well. And there's enormous tensions between India and China that might hinder its cohesiveness. So how important do you think this expansion was, and whether BRICS can actually ever have to be powerful enough to really start to be seen as a challenger?
I think you're much more expert on the BRICS than I am, but I do think this was an important step forward from these major emerging economies, and for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to find enough consensus around rules to expand the BRICS was really quite something. And it was a statement of interest by these powers in working together to do a number of things. I think one of the behind their coming together has to do with the global financial system. And I think this notion that the currencies that these countries all have, and they all are important players, particularly China, but also India and the other BRICS as well in their various markets, are very concerned about the heavy use of U.S. sanctions and the power of the dollar in the international system. It will take a lot of time before there could be an alternate approach to payments. But I think the diversifying the use of currency, monetary diversification has been a longstanding goal of China. Russia has huge stakes in that, and other countries as well. And so part of this could be a move to expand financial cooperation among key nodes in the global economy. The other area where I think there is a lot of positive momentum has been in the new development bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. I haven't followed developments as closely recently, but it did seem like that bank was becoming a more institutionalized, more capable instrument for international development. And I think as the thirst for infrastructure, for other sources of lending in the international system develops, then we may see that new development bank playing a bigger role. I'd be curious about what you think about all of this, Anita, but because it sounds like you've been following this more closely.
Just a little bit. I mean, I think it's going to be really hard to challenge the dollar. There is diversification of payments. I think the biggest problem for BRICS is India and really its relationship with China. And I think because India is so large itself that they would really need India on board to have any sort of currency challenge. I think maybe the expansion helps Beijing have more influence even within the BRICS, given that India's reluctance to participate with a lot of Chinese-led initiatives. For my part, I think it's a really interesting development. And I think it's also interesting, and I wonder if you have anything to comment on, at the same time, there are several prominent democracies, India, Brazil, South America. Do you think this really shows that Biden's idea that democracies should stick together or something and promote other democracies, democratization is something that's just not able to really represent the current situation?
Oh, well, that's a number of really great points. I think first to your first point about whether the expansion of the BRICS is a way of managing tensions between China and India in particular within that grouping is really interesting. There's a precedent in a sense for that suggests that you might be onto something in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which admitted both India and Pakistan, promoting this Eurasian vision for more cooperation in Eurasia by bringing in these two arch enemies into this fold to try to find some common ground and get through some of the challenges that some of the smaller organizations have had in promoting like regional trade in South Asia, for example, SARC, but bringing them into this bigger grouping might dilute the tension somewhat and allow for some cooperation on different areas that could be beneficial to this advancing this vision as a whole. So possibly that would also apply to the BRICS, where you might not be able to resolve some issues because of China-India tension, but that wouldn't define the China-India tension, wouldn't define the BRICS. I think that's really interesting. In terms of democracies, I think countries that are pursuing their national interests and at times their democratic identity might be most important to advancing those interests, and at other times, other types of international involvement and cooperation, if you will, collaboration with other countries who may not share the same political values might be more important. I think we're in a world where it's not going to be easy to divide countries along values lines on every issue. So it's a very rapidly changing, diverse international environment. And so the countries that are going to be successful are those that can navigate all of that. So where there are opportunities to achieve, national goals by aligning with like-minded political countries with similar political systems or like-minded countries on certain values, we may see that. For example, the post-colonial states may have a stronger core identity on certain issues. But in other respects, when other national goals can be better pursued by stressing different aspects of those countries, we may see those factors shape the kinds of international cooperation that we see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I think that is also evidence of that is certainly disappointed, and Biden is certainly to not be able to get democracies to come together in supporting Ukraine against Russia. You have South Africa, which has been somewhat supportive of Russia. You have India that refuses to take a stance on it. So kind of like going to the Ukraine conflict, there's the assumption that it's been bad for China due to its close ties to Russia. And of course, China benefits from stability more than instability. But I wonder if it's been truly a hindrance to China's global strategy or something that furthers its objectives.
I think fundamentally, China has gamed this out and decided that there doesn't have that much to lose by continuing to support Russia, and in fact has more to gain by maintaining its ties with Russia as long as it doesn't at least overtly support Russia's military operations against Ukraine. And it tries to uphold its position as a potential, some people would argue it's already lost this position, but honest broker between the international community and Russia. The thing is that many countries around the world actually are either ambivalent about Russia's invasion of Ukraine or, support it because they buy into this notion that NATO was threatening Russian security, or are just unhappy with the outcomes and the pressure it's put on global food prices and so on. But rather than blaming Russia, see the Ukraine crisis as a protracted crisis that the United States and Europe are not doing enough to resolve. So I think in this context, China has seen opportunities in maintaining its good relations with Moscow. It has benefited, of course, from good deals on Russian energy, although it's been careful not to put all its eggs in that basket. And it has also been able to make it clear that it is not aligning with the West. And so that position has helped. And of course, it's in a position where as bilateral tensions between Beijing and Washington continue to ratchet up, and they manifest in rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait. There are people in China, including those in the leadership, who identify with this fear that the West is coming for China and seeks regime change. This sounds to the average member of the U.S. Policy watching community a bit strange, but really this notion that you hear from some senior Chinese international experts that, first the United States wants to break Russia and then is coming for China. And China is really worried about the pressure that the U.S. is putting in the region. It sees the U.S. as stepping up pressure around China's periphery, encircling China, containing China. And so in that sense, that pushes China and Russia together. China wants to ensure that its long border with Russia is not a source of tension. And also, there are other factors that we could get into, including a general affinity between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, in part just related to their own lifespans and their own historical experiences, including the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was, a trauma for Putin, has been much discussed. And similarly for Xi Jinping, many people see his strong support and leadership of sort of resuscitating and revivifying the CCP as linked to that pivotal experience as 30-something when the Soviet Union collapsed. So there's a lot in there, but I think basically China sees it as its interest. It doesn't hurt its international profile with the countries that it is performing for, namely in the global south and other emerging countries. It doesn't see this having any downside to its own national security at the moment. And so it has opted for this path of continuing to play a quote unquote neutral role, which is de facto supporting Moscow during the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, some have suggested that China's actually learned lessons from the Ukraine conflict for its own activities with Taiwan, if it wanted to invade Taiwan or by force to become part of, more aligned with China, its main government. So do you think that's true? Are there lessons that they've been learning?
Well, they're watching the conflict unfold very carefully and thinking about how it might apply to Taiwan, a Taiwan contingency, if a military approach to what China calls reunification or unification with Taiwan were to be taken. It's a really different, obviously, environment. You're dealing with across a strait. It's not a land border. There are a lot of different factors, but I think one important lesson is don't overestimate your capabilities. And so, if anything, I think Ukraine has taught China that it needs to be very cautious. China will want to win. It will want to win as fast as possible. And it's been this protracted conflict, and the costs to the Russian military, the performance of the Russian military, is something that China's been watching very carefully, and also the fallout in global public opinion and what that's done to Russia as well. that's also a factor. But I think mostly these are military lessons that are being drawn about planning and preparation and capabilities for the PLA.
That makes a lot of sense. So I was thinking, you know a lot about the internal dynamics of Chinese politics. I'm sure you know that there's an argument about whether China's economic woes currently means that it might never take that next step up to a fully developed country, and that it has to lock in the gains it has now because this is the most relative power that it will have due to debt crisis, aging population, several factors. So what do you make of that argument? Do you find some validity to it, or do you think that it is over projection and misunderstanding of the economy of China right now?
Yeah, and I guess there are implications. Was the implication of your question about the use of force against Taiwan? That's an argument that's often made, is that if China believes that it's losing ground, that it will act while it has more capabilities rather than fewer militarily to unify with Taiwan. The question's an economic one, and I think it relates to whether China will escape the middle income trap or that sort of thing. I think it's hard to know. I mean, China's economy is certainly not doing very well right now. The model that exerting greater control over economic actors in the Chinese economy that Xi Jinping has adopted since he came into power, partly, in the name of anti-corruption, but also, I think, a bias toward a more statist economy. That's not had good payoffs. The Chinese economy is not rebounded after COVID as everyone expected. And as you pointed out, there are other structural factors that are going to make it really difficult to just tap into, China doesn't have all of that excess labor that buoyed its economy early on. It doesn't have enormous amounts of excess anything at this point. But, I'm not sure we can conclusively say that China's economy is not going to continue to grow. Slow and steady might win the race. And that China still has a lot of untapped capability in its economy. It remains capable, first of all, of generating advanced technologies. Who knows how far it can go if it isn't able to engage with other advanced economies and compete with them. If it's just selling Huawei to developing countries and there's no competition in those countries and it doesn't have access to advanced technologies from other advanced economies, maybe that won't grow to carry the Chinese economy in new directions in the future. But at the same time, you also have an economy that is enormous. I mean, China has this enormous domestic economy, and if it can get the right mixture of policies to allow economic activity within China to expand, say, for example, it eliminates the barriers to free flows of labor in the Chinese economy. China still constrains through its hukou system the flow of labor. There are a lot of policies that could be introduced that might generate new growth in China's economy. Other things, China doesn't have an open capital market, whether that's in the realm of possibility, but that would be a game changer. Anyhow, I think there are a lot of so-called different sectors of China's economy, probably known unknowns, but that could transform the Chinese economy. I wouldn't write it off yet, but it's clearly in a position now where things look quite grim, and it's going to take some innovation to change the current direction of growth in the Chinese economy. And one of those immediate changes might be an improvement to U.S.-China relations and more stability, which would potentially increase flows between the two countries and investment flows between the two economies, which could help Chinese economy and potentially also, I think, the United States economy, which has its own challenges.
Yeah, of course. And I'm definitely more inclined to agree with the points that you brought up. You mentioned advanced technologies. Do you think the U.S.'s policy, for example, on chips, where it has a ban on selling the most advanced chips to China, as well as preventing its allies from doing so as well, do you think things like that will be successful in curbing some of that advanced technology development in like dual use drones and other important innovations and goods that rely on those chips? Or do you think that China will be able to spur its own developments in chip making?
Yeah, I mean, I think China is investing a lot in trying to do its own indigenous innovation in this area. Whether it is able to catch up with the United States, given the restrictions that we've set up, is unclear. But what we might see are different types of technologies developing. I think of all the technologies that we are putting restrictions on, chips is one where we have these advanced chips is one where we have a real advantage. And at least in the short run, in the immediate term, in intermediate term or immediate term, we can hamper China's advances in this area. And this is a real challenge for China. I think it was not expecting this kind of response to some of its earlier policies from the United States. But in other areas, a much blurrier area where we have been collaborating with China on a lot of advanced technologies. We've had Chinese and we've had investments in China and vice versa. We've had scientists working in labs, in each other's labs and so on. And there we might see some harm to the US economy and our ability to advance in certain technologies without that kind of collaboration. That's an area where I'd really like to do more research to better understand the picture, because I think it will reveal a lot about the nature of the US-China relationship, the one that we don't talk about so much. And it's one reason that small yard, high fences is so hard. The other, of course, is supply chains where, how do you untangle those and put those complicated chains in a small yard. But I think, we're trying to get there, and there is at least more discussion. And this is one of the issues I think that our Commerce Secretary took to China when she visited China, when Raimondo went to China, is the need for dialogue, that we recognize that if we're going to have an effective small yard, high fence, we're going to have to do that in part in discussion with China. So we can't just erect random barriers with global supply chains and expect it to work out.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating too, particularly that collaboration that you mentioned and how that also affects U.S. technological advances.
Yeah, I wish I knew more, but it's kind of a question I have, is how we're going to sort that out and what the implications are for some promising technologies, and maybe who is stepping in when the United States is not participating. I'd like to understand all of that much, much more.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that brings me to the end of my questions. Did you have anything further that you wanted to comment about, Chinese global governance or something of that nature?
No, it sounds like you are following quite a lot of the same trends that I am. And I am intrigued that China has been pushing for a new vision of a global order, or at least for a new approach to global governance, not just in the United Nations, but through different multilateral organizations and structures, some of what it's initiating. And I think that's something we should all watch. It's a very different vision for how to manage international security. The way I think of it again is, if you look at Xi Jinping's concepts of security, the idea is that you keep your house tidy and organized and prevent any security challenges from spilling across the borders into my house. And I'll do the same. And that way we can all live in peace and harmony. But, the implications are, if you have a well-functioning political system that is democratic and it works pretty well and it doesn't cause problems for your neighbor, great. But if you don't, then you might need to impose more harsh and coercive tactics and strategies to manage your population. And, that is a much less attractive picture. So I think the main thing is that we have to watch this very different approach, one that I think the Chinese would like to see the state playing a much bigger role, or the party state playing a much bigger role in the Chinese case in managing security inside each individual state, but collectively all agreeing, taking care of your own house is a priority. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, well, that's really great. And thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights. It's been incredibly lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And this is great. Great to talk with you, and look forward to talking with you offline as well.
Yes, thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to the interview, and that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg's Global Politics and follow us on Twitter, now known as X, at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
And you can also reach us by email. So Anita at kellogglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take time, tell your friends, share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.